Good evening. Can you hear me without the microphone? Welcome to this, the second of Law in Context events run by the Inn. Making the Inn, as it was centuries ago, the third university, as it was then called. Although, of course, now, in this particular embodiment, it's the third and public university, because these events, rather at the inspiration of one of our two speakers, Sir Roger Scruton, is not just available to students, barristers, benchers, the people who run the Inn, judges and the like, but also to the public. And the reason for that is that it occurred to us that with the great experience we have in our senior lawyers, judges and the like in the Inn, we should be making available for public discussion legal issues that are contemporary and significant. So that's the background to this, the second of this year's events of this kind. Tonight's is concerned with freedom of speech, and I suppose that's pretty topical, isn't it? Because we're just discovering that whether or not we have freedom of speech, we have reduced freedom to think, at least without the approval, say-so, or manipulation of one or other of the massive giants that are suddenly bestriding the globe, and in what, less than 20 years of existence of such bodies, Google, Facebook and the like, facing the sort of restrictions that were imposed on Rockefeller when he took such a monopolistic control of oil as to need his empire being broken up. Now, freedom of thought is so at risk that these other organizations, less than 20 years in construction, have to be broken up. So freedom of expression is not an untopical issue. The format of these events, which has developed over the last couple of years and has been successful, is that we have two speakers who on tonight's, on this evening's event, will speak at some length each and then probably have a discussion, to be followed by a question and answer session, at which point freedom of speech will be withdrawn. Because we have an inflexible rule that any observation in the question and answer session and any question shall be no longer than 30 seconds, on the basis that properly constructed and sub-edited, nearly every proposition and every question can be reduced to 30 seconds, so sub-edit it in your head before you speak, especially if you A, say nothing by way of thanks to the speakers, we'll do that at the end, and don't bother to introduce yourself unless it's material to the issue. And also, it may well be you'll agree with what the speakers say. So in your 30 seconds, you can turn yourself into a modern-day journalist, a John Humphreys, and you can take the other side of the argument to test our speakers with, and what do you say, Sir Roger, to the following proposition? It's quite good fun. Enough from me, save, of course, that I ought to say something about our two speakers. And again, we tend to say little, on the basis that if you come from the Inn, as many of you do, you'll certainly know the Inn members. And Sir Roger is a well-known public intellectual philosopher. He read for the bar. He's an honorary bencher of this Inn. And that's all I'm going to say about him. Now, you ought to know that, of course, as you would expect if you come from the Inn, people from the Inn do this sort of thing for love of the Inn or for some other Inn-related purpose. When I come to our second speaker, Timothy Garton Ash, he has no choice but to do it only for love. And that makes him a friend of the Inn, to whom, for tonight's purposes, and generally, we are extremely grateful. But I ought to say a little bit more about him for that reason. He's Professor of European Studies at Oxford University. He's been long associated on both sides of the Atlantic with a freedom of speech program, of which he will no doubt tell you something. Author of very many books, commentator on a weekly basis in the national press, and it so happens that the author of a book, Free Speech, and although this is no book launch, it happens that the paperback books, so available at a very reasonable price, and important to bear this in mind for someone who is here simply for love, available for sale when, after the question and answer session, remember the 30-second rule, will be available for sale in the adjoining room, along with the drinks, the canapé, and the follow-on conversation. Who's going first?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Geoffrey. I'm not sure what John Humphreys would think of the notion of a modern-day John Humphreys. He might think he is still the modern-day John Humphreys. It's a great pleasure to be here. If I were talking about free speech and the law, I would feel somewhat intimidated in this temple of the law. I would feel like someone talking about Catholic theology to the College of Cardinals. Fortunately, this series is called The Social Context of the Law. So I'm going to talk about the social context, and then Roger can lay down the law. It's a great pleasure also to be speaking with Roger. We both, I suspect, one of our most formative experiences was interacting with and supporting the dissidents in Central and Eastern Europe before 1989. And in that situation, of course, free speech was an existential matter. These were regimes which lived by the big lie, by the semantic occupation of the public sphere. One of my treasured possessions on my downstairs loo wall is one of the last census verdicts delivered in Poland in spring 1989, censoring an article of mine in a Polish journal. A few months later, there was no censorship. So that's an experience we share. And that leads me on to say that the subtitle of this session, which is Free Speech in a Connected World, Old Principles, New Circumstances, is really my starting point. The principles, the basic arguments for free speech are very old ones. Many of them go back to ancient Greece. Most of them are to be found in the great chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And I doffed my cap to John Stuart Mill on the way here, because his statue is, of course, just down the road. Rather dyspeptic looking John Stuart Mill, I have to say, but never mind. But the circumstances in which we attempt to realize these principles are utterly transformed. Essentially as a result of two phenomena, mass migration and the internet. We have a situation in which tendentially everybody is becoming neighbors with everybody else. Physically, if you live in a city like London, which has people from every country, culture and religion, and virtually on the internet. More than 3 billion people now online and going up. This creates what I call not the global village, but the global city, cosmopolis. We live in this cosmopolis. This brings huge opportunities for free speech. Never in human history have so many people been able to communicate so instantaneously, so directly as so many other people, but obviously as large dangers. Someone said that surveillance is the business model of the internet, and that's absolutely spot on. The amount of data collected is beyond a Stasi general's wildest dream. Harassment, intimidation, one could go on. The internet is the world's largest sewer. Now, the effect of Cosmopolis is that the old rule of thumb, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, no longer applies, because there are people from everywhere in Rome, and what anyone says in Rome can be heard or seen everywhere. So the simple notion that you have to set the term simply for your own country or jurisdiction no longer works. In fact, what is going on over our heads is a global power struggle over the terms of free speech in a connected world. And I argue that there are essentially four forces which determine your effective freedom of speech in a given place at a given time. The first is international organizations and networks. Now, as lawyers, you might immediately think of the European Convention on Human Rights or the ICCPR, but actually, as important, informal or semi-formal organizations like ICANN, the organization that assigns IP names and numbers, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is a totally informal, not an international organization, but it's a network that has great impact on what we actually see and hear on the internet. And then there are what I call the big dogs, the big cats, and the mice. The big dogs are the states, governments, courts, law enforcement. The big cats are Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, what I call the private superpowers, an extraordinary new kind of actor in international relations. And the decisions they are making, often untransparently, unaccountably, and unappealably, have as significant an impact on what you can see and hear as the policies of most states. And then there are the mice, that's you and me. The citizens, or if we're networked online, the netizens. Of course, in the cyber utopian early years of the internet, in the 1990s, the belief was that the internet would set you free, that actually sovereignty would become irrelevant. Bill Clinton, reflecting this view, said, for China to try to control the internet would be like trying to nail Jello to the wall. And you know what? The Chinese Communist Party turned round and said, Bill, just watch us. And actually, I would argue over the last 15 years, the Chinese Communist Party has made a pretty effective stab at nailing Jello to the wall. In other words, a determined, powerful authoritarian state can reassert territorial sovereignty over the internet. One of my favorite buildings in Beijing is a building which says over its portal, National Cyberspace Administration of China. We administer our cyberspace. So the sovereign, the classic political sovereign, is still very important, but its sovereignty is more challenged and more qualified, and it's the interaction of those four forces, I argue, that determines your effective freedom of speech. Therefore, our starting point cannot simply be the laws of a particular jurisdiction, a particular constitutional tradition. We have to step back and go to first principles, to norms, and try and think about what it is we're really trying to achieve, and then ask how that might best be achieved. In one case, it might indeed be the laws of a particular state that are most important. Or it might be the terms and conditions and practices of Facebook or Google, or it might be the practice of a particular international organization or network, or some combination of the above. So what we set out to do in this project at Oxford, which Jeffrey kindly mentioned some 10 years ago, was to try and work out some draft principles for free speech in a connected world, in the world I have described. And then I went traveling around the world, talking about these principles, listening to other people, getting feedback in India, in China, in Egypt, in Brazil, and elsewhere. We put them online. You can see them there on freespeechdebate.com. They're up there in 13 languages, all the major languages of the internet. More than 80% of internet users would have linguistic access. And the very act of translating them challenges the wording of the principle. Because what we want is to have a genuinely transcultural debate And what you find is that some of the terms that we habitually use simply don't work in the familiar ways. For example, our draft principle on religion, in some other languages, our draft principle on religion is we respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. You can immediately see the point. Try saying that in Arabic or Urdu or Hindi, and you immediately come across the problem that there is no simple generic word for the believer in any faith or belief system, or none. There's either a word for the true believer in the one true faith of Islam, or some very academic term imported from Western usage. So in the very act of translation, you come across the stubbornness of cultural difference. That's the result. It's also the spine of the book. Of course, every principle has to be extremely simply formulated, and therefore I then have long chapters exploring exactly what these means and all the difficulties that arise. Please note that these principles are addressing not one, but two questions. The two fundamental questions about free speech, which I formulate as follows. How free should speech be? And how should free speech be? The first is the question of the lawyer or the lawmaker. Where should the boundaries be? The second is a question to culture, to civil society, to intellectuals, to all of us as citizens. Within the generous bounds that the liberal state should set for freedom of speech, how should free speech be? How should we practice it? In what I call, in the key phrase for me in the book, robust civility, which I'm sure we'll practice this evening. It's not just civility, it's not just having tea with the Queen. It's robust civility. There is nothing, however difficult, that you can't talk about, but you find ways in which you can talk about it without coming to blows and breaking off the conversation. So that's the spine of the book. Now, this is obviously a vast canvas. There are many, many things we could have a conversation about in this room. Free speech in universities, now under threat, media, hate speech, memory laws. I want to spend my last few minutes talking about something which has been in the headlines for the last 10 days. Facebook. This extraordinary private superpower, which if it were a country would be the largest country on earth. More than 2 billion regular monthly users. I've spent a lot of my time recently studying Facebook. If we study France, why not study Facebook? They invited me out for 3 days in January to have a look under the bonnet at how they actually establish their community standards, their editorial standards, how they make the decisions about taking down or leaving up, what the process is. It's an extraordinary experience. It's in effect making a kind of private jurisprudence for 2 billion people. My favorite moment in this 3-day meeting was when someone was telling us about the user experience of Facebook. And he said, you know, many of us are most concerned about some problems that Facebook can't address. And so I said, well, can you give me an example? And there was a pause. And then he said, death. Facebook hasn't yet come up with a fix for death. They're working on it, but not yet. Now, the context in which I want to put this very quickly is this. In that global power struggle about free speech, essentially there are 3 giant political norm setters. They are China, Europe, and the United States. China establishing a norm of information sovereignty, as they say explicitly, which has enormous traction, not just because of growing Chinese power, but also because actually information sovereignty is attractive to a lot of countries around the world. India, Brazil, not all dictatorships. The US with the First Amendment tradition, the internet giants, and Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, no intermediary liability. And then in the middle, as it were, the swing power, Europe, which out of frustration at what has been coming at us over the platform is actually moving towards more and more regulation. And the most salient example of this, which many of you will know, is a recent German Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, as it's snappily called, the Facebook law, which in effect incentivizes private censorship by Facebook. It says you, Facebook, should decide what is illegal according to a long list of German laws and take it down in advance, and if you don't do a good enough job, we'll fine you 50 million euros. So the potential chilling effect is enormous, because there's a clear incentive for Facebook to take down much more than it should. President Macron has talked about having a law against fake news. In the British debate, and we've seen it again in the last 2 weeks, there's been a rhetoric of outrage on the part of politicians, understandable outrage at what has happened with data. And then there's the familiar cry goes up, something must be done. And then we're in danger of the familiar syllogism, something must be done, this is something, so we'll do this. And the something might well be a German-type law. And of course, what Germany does today, the EU might do tomorrow. Now, I think this is a very dangerous route to go down. But I would argue that if we don't want to go down that road of the state, as it were, outsourcing censorship without transparency, without accountability, without appealability to the Facebook or the Google, then we have to come up with something better. Some mixture of regulation and self-regulation, which is more appealing. Now, I have quite a lot to say on that, but I'm conscious that we have a very stern chair here. So I will simply whiz through a list of some of the issues which would have to be addressed for an effective mixture of regulation and self-regulation. Then I'll sit down and we'll get into a conversation. First of all, absolutely for regulation, the issue of monopoly. Due to network effects, these are at the moment near monopolies. There is something close to regulatory capture in the United States. American public power is not going to regulate against monopoly, at least not at the moment. I entirely support what Commissioner Vestager is attempting to do, in principle, because pluralism is itself essential. Pluralism of platforms for free speech. Privacy and data protection, again, clearly a subject for regulation, but an awkward balance against the need for data sharing for transparency. So people blithely make generalizations about things like fake news and echo chambers, right? You all heard that. The truth is, we don't know exactly what's going on, because the only people who know are Facebook and Google, and they're not yet telling us. They may produce studies by the Facebook data science team saying everything is hunky-dory, but we can't actually just take that on trust. So actually we do have a need for Cambridge and Oxford academics to get data from Facebook, but then how you do prevent them doing with it what the gentleman in Cambridge apparently, allegedly did with Cambridge Analytica. Political advertising. Very, very important. Some have said that what Russia did with targeted advertising on Facebook may be the most effective advertising campaign in history to swing an American election. Clearly, I think a subject for political regulation. The Facebook news feed. There's a good evidence now to show that people, particularly younger people, are getting more news that is selected by algorithms than is selected by editors. Is there not a public interest in knowing something more about the algorithms determining what you see on newsfeed? We do know from good studies that misinformation is as likely to go viral online as true information. We know that because the algorithms privilege engagement. And misinformation is sexy, it's interesting. The Pope backs Donald Trump is interesting. Hillary Clinton ate my cat is interesting. It gets more engagement, right? Does it give a sufficient diversity of news, or is it strengthening the echo chamber effect? So what would transparency of algorithms look like? Is there some sort of public interest accountability for what the algorithm delivers in terms of news? Then you have the whole area of hate speech, dangerous speech, the community standards, how they're implemented, is there an appeal procedure? One of the interesting things the German law suggests is an independent, industry-wide self-regulatory body. Great idea, very attractive idea. But then where would that be? Would it just be a German industry-wide self-regulatory body, and there'd be a French one, and a Liechtenstein one, and a Belgian one, or would it be EU-wide? Or how do you have an industry-wide self-regulatory body for a global platform with 2 billion users? Is Facebook right to conceptualize its community as a single global community, therefore not taking account of global cultural difference? What about the real name policy? Yes, much of the hate speech online is anonymous, but if you're a dissident, like the ones Roger and I knew in Czechoslovakia and Poland in the 1980s, today in China or in Russia, anonymity is your lifeline. If you use your real name, you're not going to remain free for long. So there are multiple questions that actually unfold around the question of what should we do about Facebook from the point of view of free speech. And then finally, if we have developed an understanding of what it is that Facebook should do in the public interest, is that still compatible with the public interest, with their business model, or not? Can they go on making sufficient money from advertising while still doing all those things that we think they should do in the public interest? Anyway, that's what I wanted to say in introduction. It's been something of a reduced Shakespeare company, I'm afraid, but I wanted to lay out that agenda before you. My own view is that this is one area where we have to work very hard to come up with a model which does not depend on over-regulation, on too much state control of speech online, as the German law does. But in order to see off that challenge, and by the way, please note that within 6 months, Vladimir Putin had copied the German Facebook law. He'd written a Russian law which is very, very similar. In other words, authoritarian rulers everywhere would like nothing better than us to adopt those kind of laws, because that's exactly what they want to do. So we need to come up with an alternative, and I hope in this conversation we can explore what it will be. Thank you very much.
While Roger's taking the stand, I should have said at the beginning that Sir John Laws was going to be moderating this session. Unfortunately, he's unwell today, sends his apologies, and that's why you have me instead of him. Roger.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be addressing this gathering, and especially to be following Tim Garton Ash, whose book I thoroughly recommend. Of course, it's extremely difficult to disagree with anything he has just said. And we both of us recognised that this was going to be one of the problems of the evening, to manufacture disagreement about something which probably very few of the people in this room differ about. However, I think there are some issues which I could add to those that he's already raised, which I think we ought to think about. Although he's quite right to have raised all these questions about Facebook and the social media, one has to recognise that these are not directly about freedom of speech. They're much more about collecting data and misusing it. And maybe that we can have a law controlling that, even though freedom of speech is something that is protected independently. I mean, the church, after all, which was very similar to Facebook in its great moments, did a lot to maintain a kind of orthodoxy over all its members, who were potentially all the citizens of the world. Let's say all those people recognised as the faithful. And it had an index which controlled what could be published. It tried to create a uniformative opinion. It didn't distinguish very radically between misinformation and information. And indeed it was full of exciting stories which attracted people to look up each morning in their prayers exactly what everybody else was thinking. So there was, Facebook is obviously leaning on something which is there in the human condition, a desire for conformity around a doctrine and an experience which enables people to enjoy the comfort of belonging without the trouble of thinking things through. I think we should remember, therefore, that we're dealing with something which isn't just a temporary question that's confronting us now because of the media, but something which is there in human nature. And if you ask yourself the question, what is it that, why do we want to protect free speech? It immediately gives rise to a further question, which is what does speech actually do? What is it aiming at? And there are two quite different things that speech aims at. On the one hand, there is truth. In scientific communities, there is a form of language, open discussion about empirical data and theories and so on, whose sole and sufficient justification is that it's aimed at finding the truth about something. But in other communities, non-scientific communities, speech still exists without that commitment to truth. In religious communities, speech exists rather for the aim of membership. The most important goal of any religious text and ritual is that it's reinforcing the membership of those who submit to it. And membership is a completely different goal from that of open inquiry. And I think many of the threats to free speech come because absolute freedom of speech will always, in the end, conflict with some of the conditions of membership. If you look at the kind of things that people down the centuries have most objected to, the kind of pronouncements that people have wanted to shut up, it's usually those which are true. There's no great need to shut up someone who's saying something obviously false. But someone who's saying something true, for example, about the narrative of the Gospels or about the origins of the Quran, that person is running a dangerous line if he's in the middle of a community for whom these are unquestionable truths. So it's when you actually question something by saying that it isn't true that you're in trouble. So the normal purpose of speech, which is to aim at the truth, enters into conflict with this other purpose, the purpose of ensuring and reassuring membership as soon as somebody is saying something which is so obviously true that it has to be stopped. And I think that's something which is very relevant to the situation that we're moving into today. We don't have a society which is based upon a shared religion or a sense of our shared membership based in metaphysical and transcendental visions of the community. We have a political society which has tried to maintain openness about faith and about those beliefs on which people build their lives. And of course this is an extremely difficult thing to maintain. And as Tim rightly said, mass migration and the internet have made this balancing act yet more difficult for us. But we still are committed through our political order to maintaining free speech in one way or another. I don't think we ever will be able to control Facebook so that it is a truth-directed rather than a membership-directed institution. It will always have that the maintenance of this network of members as its first priority. But that doesn't matter as long as there are other institutions, other ways of relating to each other in which truth can be uttered and is protected. This is an old matter. Spinoza in the 17th century first, I think, clearly put it before us. He recognised that the absolute importance of truth for the maintenance of political order, but also for the fact that truth can only be openly confessed to by those people who are able to protect themselves from the masses. The masses will always feel threatened by the open pursuit of truth. So he had a very elitist view that in the end the philosophical circle should be quiet about this pursuit of truth, but nevertheless do it for the common good. And I think that's perhaps the situation in which we are now. But this means that perhaps we ought to be very clear about how we would protect that little circle of people like us here on this table. How we can protect ourselves from all those people out there who are offended by the things we say, and offended in particular by the fact that we feel free to say them. In the past, in this country, it has been the case that we had recourse to law in the private sphere in order to protect ourselves. If people said things about us which were threatening or untrue, we could sue for libel. All kinds of defences of our own identity and of our exercise of our right to free speech arose through the law of libel and associated matters. But we know now know that that's not going to be effective because of this change introduced by the internet. And in particular, the difference between truth and falsehood seems to be increasingly undervalued. In fact, if you think of recent events involving Russian diplomacy, we recognise that we really are living in a post-truth society, one in which the distinction between true and false is much less important than the distinction between who has the power and who doesn't. And so, in those circumstances, it's very hard to think how we would protect ourselves as people who want to think in a free and open way devoted to truth alone. And one response, and this is where I think I'll conclude, one response is to think of the universities and also in institutions like this one, the Inns of Court, as places where people can openly debate the issues of the day, and everything that bears on those issues can be openly entertained and expressed without people being punished. But we know that, unfortunately, in universities, people are now punished for entertaining thoughts which, however commonsensical they are, have come into conflict with the identity politics of the day. Identity politics is what's left when membership has gone. When you don't belong to anything that you can define, but simply want to define yourself as a potential member of a community. And this has led to extremely interesting problems in our universities when quite famous old-fashioned liberal feminist figures like Germaine Greer suddenly find that they have entertained the wrong proposition about something. She entertained the proposition that women who define themselves as men are, if they have no penis, not actually men. And this, she had no idea that this was a heretical thought until she expressed it. But having expressed it, she discovered that she was not welcome to the University of Cardiff, where she was going to utter this thought. Now, these, and that's an interesting case, but it is. There's a growing sense that you can't know in advance now what thoughts will be forbidden, because there is no clear, shared religious view or shared conception of membership. Anything that you might say in a university could be picked upon by some self-identifying member of that university as a reason for getting up and protesting and maybe beating you up like Jacob Rees-Mogg. So there is a real question how you create an institution where just anything can be said and where the truth is pursued regardless of where it leads. If universities can't be that institution, then perhaps the Inns of Court could be. It's certainly the case that so far nobody in this room has shown any look of shock on their face. But you don't know where it's going to next occur and how. All I can say is that in the past, people recognised that truth is an absolute value, and that there has to be some sphere in which it can be pursued regardless. But also recognised that there have to be social conventions, rules of politeness, what Tim calls a robust civility, which I think is an excellent phrase, which prevent people from pursuing truth anyhow and with disregard for other people's feelings. And I think that's one reason why you need enclaves like this in which that activity can be conducted. The law will never be sufficient to guarantee it. What one needs is a tradition of open inquiry, such as we in the West have managed to develop. But it has taken us 1,000 years, so we can't expect that it will be immediately understood by those people coming into the West from places where no such practice of open inquiry exists. So on that negative note, I will hand back to the chair.
Before we open it up to questions from the floor, does either of you have anything you want to comment on each other's contributions?
I would love, if I may, to respond to Roger with 3 quick comments. The first is, I myself am a skeptic about the term post-truth, because it somehow implies that we're emerging from a golden age in which the crystalline pure water of truth flowed unceasingly from the lips of politicians and journalists and Walter Cronkite. And that doesn't seem to me, I don't think there ever was. There was no such golden age. I think truth is to put it too high, but I think post-fact is a more helpful term. Secondly, you sort of said en passant that maybe Facebook is more an issue about data and privacy. I think it absolutely is a free speech issue. If there were 10 Facebooks with 2 billion people each, accessible to everyone around the world, and they all had different rules of engagement and community standards, that would be absolutely fine. But there is only one. And actually, I have seen how they do limit speech, often in a quite arbitrary way. I was present in this meeting in Menlo Park at the headquarters, a discussion about the definition of a public figure. That sounds familiar to a lawyer. Definition of a public figure. They have their own working definition of a public figure, and that determines how much criticism of that person can be made on Facebook. Most of the definition is unexceptionable, but part 4 of the definition is you have appeared more than 5 times in the media in the last 2 years. Now, I don't know what you think about that, but that sets the bar pretty damn low and opens the sluice gates for a torrent of abuse to this person who happens to have been mentioned. So it's a pretty fundamental free speech issue, and there are quite a few others. So I think we do have to go at them to understand what's going on. Finally, on universities, I couldn't agree more. We are fighting the good fight at Oxford. Ken MacDonald, former Director of Public Prosecutions, and I have actually written a statement on free speech for the University of Oxford, which is now on the university website, containing the phrase robust civility, which says the university should allow all speech that is lawful. That is the only hard limit, that is lawful. Then it goes on to say, however, we preserve conditions of robust civility. And there are different spaces in a university. So indeed, this may not be something that should be said in a student dormitory. It may not be something that should be said in the seminar room. But in a student debating society, absolutely, Marine Le Pen should be welcome. And Donald Trump should be welcome. So, we are pushing back. But we face pressure from above, from below, and from the side. The government, the prevent legislation. Some of you will know the first version of the Home Office guidelines said that we should prevent speech including non-violent extremism. As I pointed out at the time, I think that means Jesus Christ had no right to speak at Oxford. A non-violent extremist, if ever I saw one. Pressure from below, the students. And here what it is what I call the I'm offended veto. The simple subjective act of saying, I am personally subjectively offended, is held to be enough that Germaine Greer cannot come and talk, by the way, about a completely different subject, or Julie Bindell. And pressure from the side that actually these students are often using concepts that have been developed by some of our colleagues and being supported by some of our colleagues. So we have a fight on our hands, and the real problem is that 50 years ago, the battle for free speech was being fought by students. Now the battle for free speech is mostly being fought by faculty, and it's students who are trying to limit free speech. So it's a real problem.
But I agree with most of that, though I think on this post-truth idea, one should recognise a way of thinking that goes right back to Marx's theory of ideology and in the 19th century, and was taken up in a different language by Michel Foucault in Les Mots et les Choses, which actually has the effect of displacing truth from the centre of inquiry, any issue, always looking behind, d'où parles-tu? From where are you speaking? We're looking behind the actual utterance to the power relations which find voice through it. And I think that took over a lot of thinking in the literature faculties and sociology faculties throughout the university world, and it encouraged students to believe that actually truth is not what it's about. It's all about power. And the person speaking represents perhaps a power which is hostile to your interests, and therefore you have a right to use whatever weapons you can find against him. I think that is something which certainly you find that in as a standard piece of rhetoric among French leftist students who are quite agitated at this moment in their desire to impose it.
So it's interesting this, because I've done a lot of events in this project with a wide range of students at Oxford and elsewhere, and I'd say they're split roughly 50-50. And those most favourable to so-called no platforming and safe spaces are often the most privileged North American and Western students. So it's the students from China or Russia who sign up most readily for this project. And I think you're right that it's, again and again, it says this is about power relations, the speech issue. Now, of course, at some level, that is clearly true. Speech relations are power relations at some level. But the answer to that is not to close down, not to no platform Julie Bindell or Germaine Greer, but to empower speech by and about the less powerful, the weaker, the vulnerable minorities, so that, the trans issue, which is a big issue for our students, is a classic example. Don't no platform Germaine Greer or Julie Bindell. Create a platform for transgender people for the discussion of transgender issues. So if your answer is speech enabling rather than speech restricting, I'm for it.
Yes, but speech enabling for the most persecuted and marginalised of all of us, namely conservatives, doesn't exist.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Roger. You should say that. I do think there is a really, and I'm, just to make clear from where I come, my patron saint is John Stuart Mill. I'm a John Stuart Mill, small L liberal, and an Isaiah Berliner. Ich bin ein Berliner. I do think there is an issue of ideological diversity in university faculty. So diversity is now, all universities are dedicated to the goal of diversity, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and so on. And good thing, necessary, fine. up to a pint of copper, but a good thing. Equality and diversity. But there is a challenge, I think, about ideological diversity, and therefore about the range of serious arguments about what is true that our students are getting.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, in my experience, all opinions are welcome except Scruton's. Because I don't depend upon a university. I think one, again, I go back to Spinoza, one does have an obligation to create one's own little network and circle of truth-directed friends. And forget
but the
about
danger
others.
there is the echo chamber, isn't it?
Of course, that's all true. But you know, I go through my days avoiding people who look at Facebook. I'm not really so interested in what things they're looking at. But I don't avoid those people who engage in old-fashioned debate like you and I are doing at the moment. And I think that's all one can hope for.
Can I ask you both a question? Is the right to free speech a fundamental right inherent to being a human being? If so, rooted, and how far does it go? Where rooted, and how far does it go?
Golly, well, that's a modest question. But I think I've got it. You're the philosopher.
It is, of course, guaranteed by the First Amendment to the American Constitution, and there it was thought to be part of that general conception of the rights of man, which was being instigated at that moment by the Constitution. I think the right to free inquiry is, as near as anything, to being a fundamental right of a rational being, because how can you define yourself as we do, as rational beings, as persons, if we can't actually exercise the thing on which that quality depends. So I think, but free inquiry is not quite the same as free speech. Free speech is going public with your opinion about how awful everybody is. You know, that's rather different.
Yes, it's a fundamental right, but it's a fundamental right that is clearly not unlimited. That's a canard to believe that we say that is to say, free speech does not mean that everyone has the right to say whatever they like about everything in any
How
given
can it be
situation.
fundamental if it's limited?
Well, it's limited by the harm principle, by the question whether there is a greater harm that is caused by this speech, and then we get into the question of defining harm. But just on the purposes, if I may, I think next to truth, which Roger has talked about, there is the purpose of good government, which is the original argument for free speech in ancient Athens, paresia anisegoria. We need to hear all the arguments and all the available facts in order to govern ourselves well. And I also think there's a fundamental argument for self-expression or self-realization. And I illustrate this in the book by a great song by Nina Simone, which I commend to all of you. I wish I could know how it feels to be free. This is a song she sings when the South of the United States is still segregated. She's an African-American woman. I wish you could know how it feels. I wish I could know how it feels to be free. And it contains a great line. I wish you could know what it means to be me. And that makes the case for free speech in a nutshell. How can we be ourselves and be understood by others, and therefore live together well in a free and diverse society, unless you can know what it means to be me?
Easy. My second and last question before throwing it open. A sense personal, I think both of you had experience of the Eastern Europe before the wall came down. Was there anything in that experience that probably no one else has that has formed your present view that you think you'd like to tell us about?
Well, I would say one thing that came home to me was how that those areas of thinking which are absolutely central to me, or meditating on philosophical questions, whether Wittgenstein's private language argument is valid or not, how uttering that could be a crime. So I really got to value my knowledge for the first time. If it is capable of being denounced as a crime, it must be worth something. But whereas here in the university, it looked like just some kind of specialised nonsense. So that was really quite useful for me.
Solzhenitsyn's Nobel Prize lecture is built around the Russian proverb, "One word of truth outweighs the whole world." And the experience of totalitarianism and then of the collapse of totalitarianism in 1989 is in a sense precisely that. It's no accident that in the Velvet Revolution in Prague, our mutual friend Václav Havel spoke from the balcony of a newspaper called Svobodne Slovo, the free word. And as soon as people were able to speak the truth freely, this regime, which was built on lies, collapsed almost magically in front of our eyes. So I think for me, Geoffrey, that was the lesson, just how important it is to an open society and a free society to have that freedom, because a dictatorship can't coexist with it.
Thank you very much. I think we've got a roving mic, and I think it may be the event is being recorded, so if you wouldn't mind waiting for the roving mic. Just wait for the mic though, if it can come. If it can't, there we go. Thank you, Henry.
If you say that the limit to free speech should be what is unlawful, then the courts can deal with it, so there is a remedy. But free speech may cause offence outside the law, so how do you deal with that? What organisation will restrain the statements of free speech that cause offence that are not necessarily outside the law?
Well,
is there any limit that can be imposed upon a wider description of what is desirable and not desirable in the way of free speech?
Well, first of all, of course, when I said the limit is set by what is lawful, you then have to ask what is behind the determination of what is or is not lawful. So that was in the context of the university, and there I would go to Mill's harm principle. Secondly, I think it is enormously important to hold the line between harm and offence. Harm, which is primarily objective, or at least can be seen to have objective components, and offence, which in the extreme case is purely subjective. And there I think it's our business in civil society, in a civilized society, to find good manners, rules of behavior, community standards, which protect against reasonable offence. So where people might reasonably be offended, I'm all in favour of the BBC newsreader saying some people might find the pictures that follow offensive. Turn off if you want to. But I don't think people should be protected against an unlimited subjective expression of offence.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we were brought up to in a culture which warned us against giving offence, and we were told to acquire the ability not to give offence. That was part of our education. Now, so many young people are brought up with the art of taking offence. That's what gender studies is all about. Learning how to take offence at a pronoun, or whatever it is, so that you daren't speak openly anymore about the issues of the day, because somebody will say, as Tim said earlier, I'm offended by this. And I think one needs to. It is not the law that defines offence in this matter. The law has other concerns, like violence and, as he says, harm, but it doesn't, as far as I know, it's never tried to define what an offence is.
So you can't limit free speech effectively if it is lawful, or if it's unlawful and can be dealt with the courts, because there is no way, no effective way of disciplining people from causing offence, particularly if there's a clash of cultures, for example. We say some aspects of Sharia law causes offence to us, but it doesn't cause offence to another culture. And therefore, there is no effective restraint upon free speech which causes offence.
Let's see what another question raises.
Hi, my name is Alan Hennessy.
It's all right, just a short question, please, straight away.
Sure. I was very interested. I came late, so the one that's not Roger. I'm also visually impaired, so the one that's not Roger.
Yeah.
I am the not Roger.
So not Roger made a very touching reference to one of my favourite songs by Nina Simone. I wish you could know what it's like to be me. And I think you also made a very interesting point about the distinction between harm and offence. And I'd like to share with you my own...
We are encouraging people to make short points,
Well,
can you make it shortly, please?
Sure. My point is this. I am a gay, Muslim, blind, Iraqi former refugee. And I tick many, many boxes. I was the University of Cambridge's wet dream because I ticked a lot of boxes for them. And my question to you is about the distinction between harm and offence. You seek to uphold really rigid borders and intellectual borders between the notions of harm and offence. But going back to your reference to Nina Simone, I wish a lot of you could know what it was like to be me, and I wish a lot of the privileged people who come to the Oxford and Cambridge Union could know what it was like to be me, and I wish they could understand that some of their statements cause me harm. A lot of people think that they cause me offence, and they say that...
Very well, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you short. Have you got a question?
Yes, my question is, how, with all your privilege, can you seek to uphold such an artificial distinction between the concepts of harm and offence?
Thank you very
That's
much.
my question.
So I take that question very seriously. My name is Timothy Garton Ash, by the way, and I hope you and thank you for that. All distinctions are to some extent artificial, obviously. That's, thinking is about making distinctions between terms. Nonetheless, I'm distinguishing between harm, offence, harm which indeed the law must deal with, offence which might reasonably be taken, a reasonable person might take, which I believe should be taken very seriously and dealt with by civility, by culture, by rules of behaviour, by sensitivity, by tact, by understanding what it might feel like to be you, and then, as it were, the gratuitous individual taking of offence, so that I take very seriously what you say about what might feel deeply hurtful to you. But in order to understand that, in other words, in order to live well with diversity, you need to have been able to say it, and I need to have been able to hear it. So that precisely makes the point that to live well with diversity, we need free speech, not closing down free speech.
No, I totally agree with that.
Next question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Not Roger.
And while the microphone's passing, it was interesting, wasn't it, that this very weekend,
I'm deeply offended.
this very weekend, a young man, whistleblower as he may be, was outed apparently by someone in government as gay. Now that is likely no criminal offence, but it may, according to his own account, have exposed him and his family to risk, danger and quite serious harm. An example of the problem of policing offence.
My question is thinking in the context of no platforming in universities, whether in freedom of expression you also broaden that to have a scope such that it incorporates a right also to be heard or listened to. So I don't know if perhaps I'm not projecting, but my question is perhaps more succinctly, is does the freedom of expression also include the right to be heard or to be listened to?
Just on Geoffrey's point, because it's worth adding that, of course, in Cosmopolis, in a connected world, we have the problem that things that are merely offensive in this society may be deadly harmful in another one, so that in a different context. And that is, I think, a genuine difficulty in negotiating this territory. Because I think that the guy in question, his family are in Pakistan, where the norms are very different. No, I don't think that anyone has an absolute right to be heard. I do think two things. Number one, that the right to free speech has always to be construed as a right of the speaker and a right of the listener. And in each case, it is a right to speak or not to speak, and to hear or not to hear. So in an ideal world of free speech, you have the right to say it or not to say it, and I have the right to hear it or not to hear it. However, clearly, if you have absolutely no access to the media, you come from a particular group, like say the Sinti and Roma in parts of southeastern Europe, one of the worst treated minorities in Europe, who have virtually no access to media, who are only represented in highly prejudicial terms in most of the media in Eastern Europe, then that is a genuine free speech problem. So that I think the significant groups and voices in a society should be represented in the media in that society.
I would just add that this is one reason why universities exist. I assume that if you can speak in a university, someone can take up your interests and utter them there, and they will get discussion, and you can begin the question of remedying the kind of defects that you just referred to. But there must be some place where free speech can begin, if it is to reach the people who are going to benefit from it. And I think that's something that we are seeing endangered.
Can I just add one word to that, which is, if it is true that there's a strong echo chamber effect on the internet, so people are listening and hearing only like-minded people, since every childhood is in its nature something of an echo chamber, however hospitable and Catholic the tastes of your parents, the school and the university is actually the one place in your journey from the echo chamber of childhood to the echo chamber of the internet, where you can be exposed to a wide range of views and hear those views robustly questioned. So actually the role of the university becomes even more important in the world of the internet.
Before we pass to one of the next questions, will the last question offer in a sentence how you might enforce the right to be heard if it was your suggestion that you should be able to?
No, I don't think it was my suggestion. It was just a question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question over here.
Thank you. Factual question. How do the Facebook algorithms cope with people who interact with Facebook in other languages? And does that have implications for their freedom relative to the freedom of Anglophons?
So they have, you mean people interacting in Chinese with other people in Chinese?
On Facebook, in Arabic, in French, in
So
Spanish.
it's an excellent question. They have, I think 40 basically language-based editorial / review, content review teams. But what we saw in Burma, Myanmar, is
because they didn't have anybody speaking Burmese, let alone some of the minority languages, actually there was a wave not just of hate speech, but of what I call dangerous speech, genuinely danger to life and limb, against the Rohingya, which was a prelude to ethnic cleansing, which they initially completely failed to pick up. So there are two issues there. One is the linguistic and cultural competence of their reviewers, of whom there are now about 8,000, 9,000. Is that a lot for 2 billion people, or little? I think maybe a little. The other question is the reporting-based model. So their whole model is based on people have to report it first. So if, for example, everybody in England agreed that people with reddish hair should be executed, then nobody would report incitements to violence against Roger and me, even though we once had red hair, both of us. Right, so that the reporting model is itself, I think, an interesting question.
In the microphone, go to Master Sheen.
Would you accept that there is currently a we currently self-censor ourselves on the internet due to a lack of clarity and openness of mass data retention and obtaining by the likes of GCHQ, and our risk of privacy? And we have to address that question before we can actually address the question of free speech on the internet. Address privacy and our risk of privacy.
So I think it's a great question, because of course in much of the free speech literature, First Amendment literature, there's some sort of a balancing act between privacy and free speech, right? I argue that privacy is a precondition for free speech, because after all, the point about living in East Germany was if you didn't know who was listening, you wouldn't say what you thought if you thought the Stasi was listening. And so I think the data protection and privacy concern about Facebook is itself also a free speech issue.
You both, I think, worked on the basis that it might be possible to have different rules for academic communities, to which you and we would all belong, from rules which apply to the mass of the people at large. How do you think you could justify that to those who don't have the abilities to get into universities?
Spinoza said you should keep quiet about it. And I think he was right.
That's on the record. That's hard to beat, but I see absolutely no contradiction whatsoever between these two things. I mean, we all have to abide by the law in the given place, but within the law, free speech positively requires different communities with different rules and conventions, because we are all hypocrites, and we do all say different things to different people, whisper it not. And we say one thing in public, and then when we're gossiping in the bar, we say something else. So it's important that there's both the public platform and the bar. So I think having multiple different communities with slightly different conventions is actually essential to an open society.
Any more questions? 1, 2, 3. We'll take those 3 questions and then we'll call it a day.
On the relationship between causing offense and being open to other viewpoints, is there not, and I'm not talking extreme examples, but is there not a sort of mistaking causing offense for hearing a viewpoint that you don't agree with? So, for example, in the United States, where I'm from, especially in the run-up to the last election, anyone who had a viewpoint other than yours, you would be offended by, and people in my family who were of one persuasion would not even want to hear arguments of the other persuasion, even if they weren't, inherently racist or horrible in any kind of way. So my question is, how can we transcend that? And is social media making that worse in the sense that we're in our echo chambers and there's really a lack of open inquiry into hearing other viewpoints and considering them and learning from them, trying to find truth by discussion as opposed to just yelling your points of view at each other and hoping that you win at the end of the day.
Tim, you want one?
Were you going to take
No,
one?
we're taking one at a time, but that's going to be the
Oh,
last.
individually. There is a terrific book by J.M. Coetzee, the South African novelist, which I recommend to you on this point. And what he does, he looks at the state of the person taking offence. And he says, taking offence is a sign of someone who is weak, who is unsure of their own position. It is the mark of the blusterer and the bully, he says. And so we have to try and educate people to be the kind of person who does not take offence. Educate people out of the state of being so ready to take offence. And the classic example of that is, of course, Nelson Mandela. You know, he didn't take offence. He didn't consider his dignity was compromised by being locked up on Robben Island for all those years. He knew it was the jailer's dignity that was compromised by that.
Really just building on the last question, in that, to what extent is it an integral part of the freedom, the right to freedom of speech? To what extent is it an integral part of that right to not only have the ability to challenge someone or have that view challenged, but actually to have an opposing view presented? And if it is part of that right, to what extent should we be forced to be free? And in the context of Facebook, should part of that regulation, which may be enforced, come in the form of forcing opposing views to be considered?
Well, the classic on that, as you probably know, is Chapter 2 of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, where he says that even if a truth is held without being challenged, it is held in the manner of a prejudice, he says. And truth goes to sleep at the sentry box unless it's been put on its guard, so that it needs to be challenged even by counter-prevailing views which are partly false or even wholly false. So that's absolutely essential. And just to connect to what Roger said about the university, I mean, I have to say, I think it's not only Scruton who is not welcomed in the university, and you've been welcomed in a few universities. But I do think there is a problem about the, as it were, ideological diversity of views that we are getting in our universities at the moment. I think that's a genuine concern.
Yes, I think though you can open the space to opponents of established views in the university, but you might not actually find any opponent to step forward and utter them. That's the problem. So I think there are views which are deeply entrenched in the university culture. For instance, the belief in the equality of all humans, political, social, etc., which nobody will challenge, not because it's too dangerous, but because it's not occurred to them that this is a piece of nonsense. And somebody might suddenly step in with that challenge, and all you can say is that there's an obligation to create space for that person, but not actually to go out and find him. Maybe you never will. And I think that's the BBC has this problem, because in every issue it has to try and find the other side. You've got the mathematician giving you the proof that 2 + 2 = 4 from Prager's Foundations onwards. And they haven't yet found the person to come on the BBC and say that 2 + 2 = 5. But you often feel that they're going in that direction, and that is hardly to benefit free speech, I would say.
The last question, I think, over there, and then...
Tim, I think your hard line in the context of free speech at your university was whether a given free speech would be unlawful. Suppose the UK Parliament were to write a new law similar to one that I believe operates in Canada, to the effect that the statements made by Jermaine Greer would not be lawful. Do you think, in your view, at least normatively, that would be the end of it? You would say this is unlawful, therefore this ought not to be disseminated? Or do you think you have more of a substantive view that goes beyond just lawfulness?
A great question to end on, and I have a two-part answer to that. The first part is that I think that an institution like the University of Oxford should abide by the law. So I think our answer to that should be to nobble every MP in sight and get them to change that law, because it's a very bad law. I mean, that's what you do in a democracy. Okay, is that really start a campaign. As an individual, practicing Max Weber's ethics of conscience rather than ethics of responsibility, I absolutely think that civil disobedience is at some times and in some places necessary for the defense of free speech. And some of the greatest heroes of the battle for free speech, the heroes of my book, like Nelson Mandela and like Václav Havel, have of course practiced civil disobedience.
Yes, I agree with what Tim has just said. There is a recognised limits of free speech already in the law in this country. Some of these limits are defined in common law, like sedition is unlawful, criminal assembly, incitement, so on. There's quite a lot of these things which could be stretched to cover a lot of things that people are worried by today. But these are not, on the whole, statutory matters. It's not Parliament who's decided them, but they've come down to us over the centuries of people recognising that some things really cause too much trouble to be permitted. And especially our experience of the 17th century riots and the opposition between the Puritans and the establishment at that time.
Thank you both very much. I hope you found this an interesting and provoking evening. I noticed a couple of examples of freedom of speech getting through unchallenged, like the observation about gender studies, which was Roger's expression of free opinion.
Free contempt.
Free contempt, and nobody challenged him. And I also noted that there was no suggestion from anyone that the Facebook and so on will self-correct in the way that perhaps earlier monopolies of thought control might self-correct. But we've had a great deal to think about. And if you find this evening of interest, I should just tell you that the next two, one's on Monday, April the 16th, where I and others will be talking about the end of a phase of international criminal trials for war, and we very much hope that John Laws will, on Monday the 14th of May, be engaged in a similar process to tonight on aspects of Christianity and other religions. Meanwhile, it is my great pleasure to invite you all, before you go there, to look at the book and have a drink. My great pleasure to invite you to show your gratitude for our speakers who've given us a truly stimulating evening.